The war has been raging on for years, and now 2 more factions are ready to throw their hats into the ring. Will anyone make it out alive? Howdy, my name is Lily from MakeCraftGame, and before we get into it, I'm going to do that thing where I tell you to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, it's been a bit since I've done a video, but I am so excited to be talking to you about the Root Marauder Expansion from Leader Games. In this box, we have 2 new exciting factions, an advanced setup variant, which allows for some difficult and enticing play, and the hirelings mimicking the base 4 factions. Now, I don't know too much about hirelings, so I'm not really going to cover them in this video.
The Lord of the Hundreds. A true leader in the forest, you're the true voice of the woodland, and dissenters will burn.
The Lord of the Hundreds is a really interesting faction for several reasons. First, there is no faction as moody as the Lord of the Hundreds. They start the game with all of their moods unlocked and have to choose a new mood each birdsong. After all, you can't be stubborn 2 days in a row. Each mood will give the warlord a special ability that will only affect the warlord's clearing if the conditions are met. The Lord of the Hundred also cares about items and can interact with runes. They're the only faction in the game besides the Vagabond that can do so, and now the Vagabond has some competition for those juicy items. But items aren't all benefits to the Lord of Hundreds. If an item is in the Horde, it will lock off a corresponding mood. So, have a bag? Well, maybe now you're not feeling as relentless. The items in your Horde will increase the number of actions you can take during the daylight phase of your turn. However, the items will also lock off more moods. This will create an interesting push and pull where you have to choose between specialized actions and standard ones. The locking of moods will also influence what items you want to hoard in your Horde. Why collect 3 different items and lock off 3 different moods when you can collect 3 of the same item and only lock off 1 of them? There's a really interesting dynamic between balancing moods and actions, which I feel like adds another layer of complexity to this faction. There are 2 types of actions the Lord of the Hundreds can take during the daylight phase: command actions and advance actions. For each command action, you may either move, build, or battle. The number of command actions you can take is dictated by the number of command items you have in your Horde. But the advance action is where the Lord of the Hundreds has some real fun. For each prowess item you have in your Horde, you may move and then may battle in a clearing with your warlord. The advance action shows the Lord of the Hundreds great mobility, aggression, and how important the warlord really is. The advance action brings a lot of aggression to the table, since battling is baked into the Lord of the Hundreds core system. This aggression is especially apparent if you consider the Lord of the Hundreds' main method for scoring. In Evening, they have a passive ability which allows them to score victory points for all clearings they control without enemy pieces. This desire for empty clearings really drives the aggressive nature of the faction, because the best way to have a clearing without pieces is to battle and remove those pieces. The Lord of the Hundreds is incentivized to be aggressive right out of the gate. If another faction gets in their way, the advance action allows the warlord to move in and battle to remove as many pieces as possible. This high level of aggression really adds another layer of depth to the gameplay, and really brings a more aggressive and warlike state to the game. The Keepers in Iron. You've returned from exile, and you must recover the relics lost from the wars of old. The Keepers in Iron are one of my favorite new factions. You have to do this complex dance around the board to try to get the relics you want while avoid taking serious losses, or worst yet, getting removed from the board entirely. The Keepers in Iron are very similar to the Woodland Alliance, as they score in bursts rather than having a slow, steady pace over the course of the game. But they also have a similar vibe to the Eyrie, because they have a retinue, which is very similar to the Erie's decree, that indicates when and where you can take your actions. But unlike the Eyrie, any unused actions are just lost for the turn, and they don't have any major negative effects. The goal of the Keepers is to collect all of the relics that are hiding in the forest. At the beginning of the game, relic tokens are placed out based on the Keeper warriors' starting positions. During the daylight phase, the Keepers can delve to pull these relics from the forest into a clearing. And here, the Marauders Expansion brings another level of forced conflict and aggression into the game. Because the keepers can't delve in a clearing where there are enemy pieces, they must first battle. And at the end of that battle, the keepers have to rule that clearing in order to delve. And this is only the first obstacle in gaining a relic. Each relic has a number, hidden from the players, that is revealed when it is delved. This number could be 1, 2, or 3. And here's the fun part. These numbers correspond to the clearings surrounding the delved forest that the keepers must rule in order to delve for that particular relic with no negative consequences. If they control the required number of clearings, then they gain the relic and nothing else happens. If you do not rule the needed clearings surrounding that forest, then you have to discard the card from your retinue that you used to take the action. But you do get to keep the relic in the clearing. So you have a relic. Now what? The next important step for the Keepers in Iron is Recover. This allows you to take a relic from the map and place it on your faction board. This is also the main way for the Keepers in Iron to score points. But to recover a relic, you first need a card in your retinue that matches a clearing with the corresponding way station. And the way station needs to match the type of relic being recovered. And you need to have clearings equal to the number on the relic controlled on the board card matches the way station. And the keepers need to rule over clearings equal to the number on the relic, matching the suit of the card being committed to take the action. Yeah, I know. It's a little confusing and there's a lot of matching going on. If all the conditions are met, then the action goes through. The keepers can recover any number of relics in that clearing. If the conditions are not met, the keepers can recover the relics, but the first relic that does not meet the requirements will stop the action from continuing and burn the card used for the action, removing it from the retinue. The Keepers in Iron work on 2 different clearing ruling axes, and they can be a little intimidating for new players. That being said, I love the brain burn this faction puts me under. And once you get over that initial learning curve, the faction can be surprisingly intuitive. These new factions are extremely fun to play and bring a whole new level of dynamics to the game. I would recommend Lord of the Hundreds for newer players as it's more straightforward, although I have noticed the moves can cause a bit of frontal overload. The Keepers in Iron are more complex up front, but run smoothly once you get to know how their scoring works and their general faction tempo. Since both of these factions are relatively new, there are plenty of guides and in-depth explanations online. But now, let's get into something I'm really excited about. Advanced Setup. The Advanced Setup, or AdSet cards, break the game wide open and give players meaningful decisions during setup. Factions are no longer restricted to starting in a corner or setting up in a specific order, and some factions have a modified setup from what's written on the back of their player boards. Now the factions are split up into 2 types, red and white. Red are what I like to consider coin or counter-insurgent factions. These generally have a higher reach and a lot more warriors. The white factions are more insurgent factions, although not all of them really fit that description, but they have generally less warriors and less reach for the game. The AdSet cards are shuffled together, and cards are dealt based on the number of players plus 1. There must be at least 1 red faction in the draft, because otherwise the game can go wildly out of balance. This setup can create some crazy combinations, and an all-red draft? Totally possible and absolute perfection. In the official rulebook, if the last faction drawn is a white faction, then it is considered locked until 1 red faction has been chosen by a player. I have seen some people modify the draft where they don't lock the last faction so long as 2 or more red factions are in play, because one of them will have to be chosen. After determining the start player, the person playing last will choose their faction first. Remember to have your hand of cards drawn. AdSet has you draw 5 cards before choosing your faction. Then, you'll choose your faction and fully set it up on the map. After everyone has chosen their factions, everyone will take their 5 cards and discard down to 3 and curate their hand. Typically, the AdSet cards reference where you can set up based on other players' homelands. So the earlier you choose your faction, the more options you'll likely have to place on the map. If you ever can't fully satisfy the requirements of placement, you have to fulfill them to the best of your ability. The Marauders expansion takes Root to a whole new level. AdSet adds a layer of depth and entanglement to setup, while the factions bring more aggression to the game, and this could be a negative for people who don't like conflict. There's not a lot you can do to stop a warlord on an aggressive rampage, and more often than not, the only way to stop an aggressive offense is to go on the offensive yourself, and this is something that a lot of factions don't really like to do. So, instead of initiating battles, factions like the Corvids or the Lizard Cult might end up spamming warriors into the warlord clearings, because that creates a nuisance for the warlord to take care of. Tempo control is everything. The Keepers in Iron have such great scoring potential that they need to be hit before they get out of control. This sometimes means battling without getting any real reward. The dynamics these factions bring to the game create more tense interactions and a lot more violence. An advanced setup takes that entanglement up another 10 notches. The possibility of starting in a variety of locations brings new opportunities to every faction. This can mean great benefits or great losses. A game can be lost on turn 0 from setup if you're not careful. Picking great factions early can also lead to devastating interactions since you play after people who picked later. One major example of this is the Underground Duchy setting up in multiple clearings, and not all of them are homelands. The Corvids can set up after the Underground Duchy on top of a clearing that isn't a homeland and come in with an extort on turn 1. Losing a card can be a rough setback, and why order of picking factions is so important. But then again, passing up on a good faction means that you don't get to play that faction. Curating your hand also greatly helps each faction. But even with a higher chance of getting cards you can use, some hands just don't work well with the faction mix, and you're still flying by the seat of your pants. All in all, the Marauders expansion is one of my favorite Root expansions. I love how the factions fundamentally change the dynamics of the game, and this increased aggression pairs really well with the increased options that advanced setup brings. For me, this expansion truly tips Root into the full wargame experience, where there's a push and pull, will they, won't they game being played before total annihilation happens. And all that's left is a smoldering forest with a few lone warriors dragging themselves across the finish line. For each command action, you might either... But now let's get into something I'm really excited about. AdSet. It's upside down! It's okay. You can do it. You can do it. You can do it. Can you do it? Yes, you can do it. I believe in you. I don't believe in you. I am the queen of stuff. Jazz hands! I'm losing my mind.